to character evidence, exceptions for a defendant or a victim in a criminal case. So this is a criminal case, of course, and we have a defendant and a victim. The victim's dead, of course, Helena Hutchins. The defendant is Alec Baldwin. So these exceptions may theoretically apply in these cases. So exceptions for a defendant or a victim in a criminal case. The following exceptions to the general prohibition on character evidence apply in a criminal case. A defendant may offer evidence of the defendant's pertinent trait. And if the evidence is admitted, the prosecutor may offer evidence to rebut it. So the defendant may be charged with a crime of violence, for example, a murder, a manslaughter, say a voluntary manslaughter. And he wants to introduce evidence of his peaceable nature. He wants to bring witnesses onto the stand who say, this guy would never unlawfully kill somebody. He's the most peaceful person we know. That's his character. Well, that may be admissible by the defense, but if the defense does get it admitted, then the prosecution has an opportunity to rebut it by introducing rebuttal character evidence. So now the prosecutor, although they would normally be prohibited by bringing witnesses on the stand to say that the defendant had a violent character, if the defendant introduces evidence that he is a peaceable character, he opens the door to the prosecution being allowed to admit rebuttal evidence that, in fact, he has a violent character. Part B, a defendant may offer evidence of an alleged victim's pertinent trait. And if the evidence is admitted, the prosecutor has certain options as well. So again, this might be, for example, a self-defense case where you've killed someone in arguable self-defense. You want to argue that they have an exceptionally violent character, that you were not the initial aggressor, they were the initial aggressor, and their violent character is relevant evidence to them being the initial aggressor in your conflict. So you may be able to get that there, the victim's character evidence in that context. Now, I'm not going to dive into this because that's just inapplicable to the facts of this case. No one is arguing that Helena Hutchins was shot because she earned it in any way. So that's character evidence exceptions for defendant or victim in a criminal case, A, B, and C. Then there are exceptions for a witness. So if you take the witness stand, every witness has their character vulnerable to examination because the role of the jury is to, in part, evaluate the credibility of witnesses, and character goes directly to credibility. So normally, the state would be prohibited from bringing in character evidence about a defendant unless the defendant decides to take the witness stand and testify on their own behalf. At that point, that opens the door to character evidence about the defendant, especially as to the issue of credibility, which is one of the reasons that many criminal defendants will not take the witness stand, because they often, let's face it, most criminal defendants tend to be criminals. They have a lot of prior bad acts that are not normally admissible in front of the jury in a particular case, but become admissible, arguably, if they take the witness stand to testify in their own behalf. Now we get to the thick of it. 404B. This is what the motion is really going to be getting at here. Other crimes, wrongs, or acts. Prohibited uses of evidence of other crimes, wrongs, or acts. Evidence of any other crime, wrong, or act is not admissible to prove a person's character in order to show that on a particular occasion, the person acted in accordance with this character. So the prosecutor can't argue, hey, we know this defendant acted like an a-hole this case because he's acted like an a-hole in previously unrelated instances. And we're going to bring in witnesses to testify about those previously unrelated instances and about how the defendant acted like an a-hole in those other circumstances. That would not be admissible evidence. It's a prohibited use of other crimes, wrongs, or acts. But there are permitted uses of other crimes, wrongs, and acts. Character evidence may be admissible for another purpose, such as proving motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, plan, knowledge, identity, absence of mistake, or lack of accident. Now, many of these exceptions to the general prohibition have to do with something we might refer to as modus operandi, the method of operation. So if a criminal defendant's charged with a second-story burglary of a dwelling, and it can be proven that he's done this before. Now, technically unrelated to this burglary, but he uses the same techniques. He uses an extending ladder. He brings a glass cutter to cut a circle in the glass, like in the movies, right? So he can reach in and open up the window without having the sound of breaking glass. These specific technical details of his method of operation from unrelated events. It's not this burglary, or it may have occurred in this burglary, but we're trying to, the prosecution's trying to argue, we know it was this guy who committed this burglary because we can prove he used this method in other burglaries. Those are prior bad acts, but it's not being brought in to show he has a bad character. It's being shown for purposes of intent, preparation, plan, knowledge. Also, lack of accident. So accident is a legal defense, just like self-defense is a legal defense. If something is genuinely an accident, it ought not carry criminal liability. So someone might try to raise the legal defense of self-defense. Alec Baldwin might try to raise it here. This was an accident, and therefore I should have no criminal liability. The trouble with the defense of accident is the person claiming it really has to have zero fault. The outcome was completely unforeseeable. Pointing what you know to be a real gun at another person, manipulating, manipulating the trigger and hammer and having it discharged, that's not completely unforeseeable. So I don't see a defense of accident working here. But if someone were to claim accident, the prosecution might say, well, they're claiming that it was completely unforeseeable that this outcome would occur when they did X. We have evidence that they've done X previously and had this outcome. So they should have known. They had good reason to know that this outcome was a predictable consequence of X. So that would be a reason to get prior bad acts admitted as evidence, contrary to the general prohibition. Then we have section 3 here, notice in a criminal case. So if a prosecution wants to exploit one of these permitted uses in 404B2, they have to provide notice to the defense. Provide reasonable notice of any such evidence the prosecutor intends to offer, so the defendant has a fair opportunity to meet it, so they're not ambushed in the middle of the trial. And articulate in that notice the permitted purpose for which the prosecutor intends to offer the evidence. So the specific one of these exceptions to the general prohibition that we just saw, proving motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, etc.